What is going on, everyone? I'm Cucumber, and today I thought I would finally get around to talking about the Dark Souls 3 DLC, both the Ring City and Ashes of Ariandel respectively. This will not be some really in-depth review of the content looking into every detail, but I will nitpick and point out some obscure aspects about certain things that I both enjoyed and disliked about both pieces of content. I know that sounds like a review, but I wouldn't consider it as such. As of me writing this script, I just finished my second run through Ashes after beating the Ring City 3 times, and I have experienced, in my eyes, a reasonable range of difficulties, going from a New Game 4 character to a New Game 2, and finally a brand new character. However, I have not started Ashes on my brand new character yet. Anyway, with this video, I just wanted to summarize my loves and hates concerning both the Ring City and Ashes of Ariandel. Because I started the DLC content with the Ring City, I thought I would go into my likes and dislikes concerning the overworld and the content that does not delve into any of the bosses for that DLC first. Let's get my dislikes out of the way by starting at the beginning. The first thing I noticed when I teleported into the Dreg Heap was the lag. Playing on PC, I immediately jumped to the conclusion of poor optimization, which I have no doubt that it is. However, the lag may seem like a strange thing to gripe about, but au contraire, my friends. The reason I'm mentioning it is because the lag is confounded to the very beginning area for some reason. The moment I reached the Earthen Peak Ruins bonfire, the lag disappeared for the rest of the DLC. If anything, I would just want to say that a little more work should have gone into putting the finishing touches on the beginning areas. What I also noticed about the lag was that it seemed to only occur in the areas populated by the murky humanity sprites. The thing that makes this whole situation funny is how I considered it another gripe to not have included those weaponized humanity sprites further into the Earthen Peak Ruins. I thought those ads were interesting, as they caught me off guard several times with their monstrous charge attacks. Also, the aspect about these little guys that I loved the most was how there were instances where they appeared to infinitely spawn, or they spawned a lot. These moments had me imagine two different scenarios. One being how the infinite or mass spawning put into consideration how many people were possibly buried in the ashes. Or two, being how the murkies could have been a representation of the player. Your humanity only truly fades when you give up hope. Therefore, these ads continuously dying and reviving until they lose hope of killing you makes me think how I feel about dying over and over to the bosses. Or I may be just thinking too much of nothing, and I will possibly do that a lot during this video. Moving along with my next issue with the Ring City, it's those freaking archers, man. The entire section of trying to maneuver around these incarnates of death had me wanting to put a bullet in my temple, as I believe this may be From Software's response to people just sprinting around all the enemies they have laid out for the player. The notorious runbacks involving the player skipping everything has become so pervasive, it seems From wanted to give you another big middle finger. But other than that, I believe From does deserve a point for implementing something different, regardless of the fact of how much I didn't like it. The next gripe I had with the Ring City were the NPC invasions. Now for some context. As for me, being not so great at the game, I despise Dark Souls PvP. It is the reason I play offline mode without ever putting on an Ember, because every time I see that text, Player X or NPC Y has invaded your world, my nether regions immediately become flaccid. I could barely do the PvE. I do not need a player or an NPC designed to ruin my day coming along and doing so. The main issue I had with the NPC invasions was how even when I did not have an Ember active, they still spawned. If anything, make it to where the NPC invasions use a red soapstone or something and you have to summon them in for a duel, because I know this is more of a personal problem, but there is never a day when I want to be invaded, regardless if it's an NPC or a person. Finally, I know I said I would not go over any of the bosses just yet, but the Spear of the Church fight is not even a boss. I know From might want to push players into PvP, but if my little rant just now did not paint the picture of my hate for it, making an entire boss fight around PvP is just stupid. The biggest issue I have was how the NPC you fought meant to represent a player does not even act like a player. It only dodges like a player. If this boss is meant to push people into trying PvP, having the NPC going from sword and board to pyromancy to bow and arrows within a minute is not a good representation. In the very end, PvP bosses, in my opinion, should not even be a thing. Or if they have to be, make them optional. just like the PvP. After that little tirade, let me quickly discuss what I liked about the Ring City overworld. For one thing, the difficulty, I felt, was there. The angels and trying to bob and weave around the area while you search for the little pod creatures was generally cool, as they injected a sense of urgency while they pelted you with beams of death, and the amount of damage that even just the base, those murky ads did. I thought it was pretty good. But without going into the other bosses, I did not have any other major points to discuss concerning what I liked. In all honesty, the overworld for the Ring DLC just wasn't very good, in my opinion. But let's move on to the bosses really quickly before this gets too weird. The bosses. One of the best parts about Dark Souls. I want to confront the explanations of each of these bosses, the actual bosses at least, by starting with what I appreciated and then quickly going over what I did not like, because on the whole, I found I enjoyed each of the bosses more than I did not like them. Starting with, of course, the Demon Prince fight, I had two major points that caught my attention. The first being me probably reading too much into the fight's design, as I noticed somewhat of a parallel between this fight and the Twins Prince's fight. The whole idea of two becoming one, while one became two with their respective fights, sort of made me appreciate the Demon Prince a little bit more, especially with Lorien being the one having killed the Demon Prince initially. Also, the aspect of how the fight changed depending on which demon was killed first was an interesting take, which I enjoyed because it can turn the whole situation completely on its head depending on which one you killed first, and it can provide different experiences for anyone who tries the boss. However, that same mechanic stems into my major dislike concerning the Prince because of how much easier the fight got, for me at least, if you killed the demon from below last, so he would use the laser beam rather than the fire orbs. The fire orbs that shot fireballs seemed to me like much more of a devastating ability, as the boss was preoccupied with summoning even more orbs to rain down on the battlefield. All in all, I thought the Demon Prince was a proper introduction to a very fun DLC, but the scaling or something could have been done to make the laser beam ability more powerful or more devastating, because the moment I figured out how much easier the fight got by going from the demon below rather than the demon of pain, he became like 10 times easier. So, skipping over the spear encounter, I want to discuss Slave Knight Gale. This boss was by far the most difficult fight of the DLC, bar none for me. I spent hours trying to down him as I bashed my head against the wall until it finally fell after well over 30 attempts. Remember, I'm not that good at the game. If you have seen my top 5 Dark Souls 3 bosses video, you'll know that I'm not good at bosses who are really quick and have long chained combos. So when From made Artorias and the Abyss Watchers have a love child, I was in for a ride. No, I find his overwhelming difficulty to be a good aspect about Gale, because he could very well now be in the top 5 hardest bosses for me, if not top 3. And like I said before, I really do enjoy the similarities Gale has between Artorias and the Abyss Watcher encounters, with all the jumps and spins and twirls, and the extra reach he gets later on in this second phase. The next thing I like does not concern the boss, but rather the boss room. While it can be seen as dull as just a bunch of ash dunes, I really took notice with the ruins about the room, and outside with Lothric and the other kingdom in the background to be quite scenic. The last thing concerning the room I found to be really cool was how after you defeated Gale, if you were to return to his boss arena, it becomes night, which I thought was an interesting detail. Finally, this may be the casual in me talking, but how you could stagger Gale was a welcomed mechanic. There were several instances where I was about to get my house rocked, but barely avoided it because I managed to stagger Gale before he could execute his attack. Every time that happened, my heart skipped because I knew I pretty much deserved to get bent, but I avoided it anyway, and that made me feel really good. But other than that, I want to go into what I did not like about Gale very much. Of the sparse reviews that I had seen of the Ring City, I had always heard the criticism or mentioning that Dark Eater Midir had an immense health pool. I'll go over Midir next, but I believe that if anyone had a giant health pool, it was Gale. It may have been Gale's defenses that protected him from me doing any meaningful damage to him with my noob sword, but regardless, I found that Gale's health seemed very high, and would say that if anything felt off about him, it would be his health pool. Finally, the big bad boy himself, Dark Eater Midir. In all honesty, I have a mixed bag of feelings towards this boss. As usual, I'll start with what I liked about him. The first thing that revealed itself to me was Midir's similarities to Calamite, with him standing up on his hind legs for a fire attack to doing that iconic blitz charge at you. I thought that was really cool, having those instances of similarities between the two. But other than that, the design of the boss was really epic. Having the boss be a colossal, dark-consumed dragon was top-notch. I also really liked the look of the room he was in as well. The dark, ominous cavern infested by the abyss was the perfect setting for one of the most cinematic bosses in the game. However, the things that I liked about Midir ends there, as I find that I have a notable amount of criticisms for this boss compared to the others. Bar Spear, of course. The first issue I want to highlight is how his scaling seemed off or skewed in some way that I can't put my finger on. When I initially did the boss, I was on my New Game 2 character, and it took me 2 attempts to kill him. Then I attempted him on my brand new character to actually one-shot him. Finally, after I almost jumped headfirst off my roof following multitudes of failed tries at Gale, I took my rage to Midir on my New Game 4 character to have him take well over an hour to beat. Something about him felt off, and I just wanted to mention that. The next thing I want to discuss is not that health pool, but the running. Now, because of the way I fought Midir, aiming solely for the head for the entire fight, his health was not much of an issue in the grand scheme of things, as I did a decent amount of damage per attack to his face. The problem I mainly had, as I just said, was all the running I had to do. Midir, for me, was well over a 6-minute fight. And for about 4 of those minutes, it was me trying to catch up to him as he took leaps and bounds past me across the room and soaring across and just like flying everywhere. I just could not keep up with him. I believe that this issue of him soaring all around was because of his size in general and the size of the room as well. From wanted to make Midir epic and a giant of a challenge in more ways than one. As a result, Midir ended up being able to go hundreds of feet away without actually hitting anything as he charged. If I were to take a guess, I could have sworn that my stamina during the encounter also acted differently. My stamina seemed to go down more slowly than usual when I ran, and it also regenerated a lot quicker as well. However, it could just be the case that I spent most of my time running rather than attacking and dodging, so my stamina bar was almost always full, unlike encounters with Gale where I was starved for stamina. But it may just be conjecture and I don't know, I may be going crazy at this point. The next thing is more of a nitpick than anything else, as I found that the use of dark abilities by Midir appeared lacking considering his name. This is more of an aesthetic critique, as I would have appreciated dark fire rather than the regular stuff that I got during my fights with him. I hope you pardon this tangent, but I just realized a positive aspect of Midir while writing about the dark mechanics, so bear with me. Whenever Midir uses his beam attack, it was always preceded by him using and exhausting his regular fire, and the beam came out shortly thereafter, as if he tried to push more fire out but could not, and as a result, his dark energy was pushed out. This idea puts Midir's attempts at killing the player into perspective, as he did everything, exhausting his energy and then some in order to keep his vows of protecting Lady Filianor. Okay, without going too far off track, that really sums up the Ring City and my thoughts on it. I mean, like I said, it wasn't supposed to be, really in depth or anything. So let's travel to the painted world of Ariandel. There were a lot of things that I appreciated with this DLC, even though it was a lot smaller than the Ring City. Let's start with the visuals. I loved the snowy environment we delved into. I found that it was definitely a step up from the painted world of Ariamis from Dark Souls 1, especially with the blizzard in the beginning area, and the whole idea of obscuring sight was also prevalent throughout the DLC, with the environment and enemies having their own methods of making sure you cannot see what is in front of your face. I absolutely loved that theme of obscured sight because it added a sense of strategy in terms of the enemies. Whether they be sweeping snow up into the air or blasting fire in your face, there was an intelligence behind the design of the enemies to try and prevent you from seeing what was coming next, and I loved that. Once again, talking about enemies, this gets me on to another thing I noticed about 2 different enemy types, the wolves and the Farron followers. Dogs in Dark Souls have always been the bane of my existence, as they ravaged me with non-stop charges, jumps, and dodges, and they normally have no quarrels with attacking and showing no fear of death. The wolves of Ariandel are different. There was an air of fear that surrounded these wolves. They bit in your direction, they barked and snarled, and they circled you as they waited for an opening. On many occasions, I could just sit there for almost a minute without moving, and the wolves would have made no progress in terms of bringing me down. The wolves suggested, with their delayed and reserved actions, that they were afraid of you, the player, and waited for you to make the first move so they could act accordingly. Once you did make your first move, the wolves would then take advantage of, if you used it, the lock-on system. If you happened to be locked onto a wolf, many times it would simply circle you while your camera followed blindly, only for you to be attacked from behind by another wolf. The wolves jumping towards you, and on many occasions completely missing you, had the same effect, as you immediately turned around to follow the wolf, leaving you open for attack. Normally, the implementation of encounters with many enemies is deemed artificial difficulty. It is easy to stick 20 hollows on you that do enormous amounts of damage and call it a day. But the wolves are different, as they have the same purpose, to overwhelm the player, but their use of numbers in a strategic way facilitates actual difficulty in my eyes. The same could be said about the Farron followers. The wide variety of utilities the differing followers have creates an atmosphere of teamwork once again. While the shield bearers pressured you backwards, the torch carriers would obscure your vision with fire breath as the spear throwers sniped you from a distance. The followers work as a team, and I love how From, in one way or another, fixed the issue that sticking a bunch of ads on the player creates by giving the numbers of enemies the means to be strategic in their killing of you. In other words, I'm glad From did not just throw a bunch of enemies our way and called it a day. The next thing that took me by surprise was how you got the opportunity to fight the Grave Tender's Great Wolf throughout the beginning areas of Ariandel. These instances provided a hint of what you were in for when you later fought him as a boss, and I loved how From portrayed this wolf as a real threat that had a reach not only within his boss room. The next thing I took notice to was the layout of the painted world itself. While it was still linear, it felt rectangular, for the lack of a better word. It's not exactly a straight line like much of the rest of the game, even the Ring City was more of a linear path than Ariandel was, but there were times where I felt I could get lost in the streets and the paths going down into the depths of the painting, and I loved that world layout. My last major commendation of the overworld was the paradigm between the two different Corvians. The more humanoid Corvians that could be found outside the chapel and on the road of sacrifices welcomed the rot that was infesting the painting, while the avian bird-like Corvians wanted the world to burn. The varying mindsets between the two established an internal conflict that I applaud From for including. It could also be parallelism between the child painter and Sister Fried, as the child needed to witness flame, while Frieda was content with Ariandel rotting away. That does it for what I appreciated about the Ashes overworld, but let me get to what I did not like about it out of the way really quickly here. The first thing that I utterly despised were those claw and sword wielding Corvians. Pardon me again for this next tangent, but the combat style of these ads is abhorrent in my eyes. If I were to take away any type of attack, it would be those freaking flurry attacks. It is such lazy design to make enemies swing their arms really fast and call it fighting. It's almost like a one-shot mechanic. Anyone can make an attack hit really hard and say the ability is difficult. And the same thing can be said about flurry attacks. It is not even a unique problem with these ads. The entire game is plagued with flurry attacks, and these Corvians were the last straw for me personally. There's a line between attacks and combos that are really fast, like Dancer's, Pontus, and Fried's moves, and being outright ridiculous random arm swinging. I am personally just sick and tired of seeing that crap. But before I get too angry, let me start with the next thing. It's not much of an issue, but I found the platforming in both Ashes and the Ring City to be a nice try, but overall it is not something that is all that refined and definitely needs improvements if From wants to continue with these platformings when they did that with the roots, is what I'm talking about, the roots that you had to go down and stuff. So, but all in all, those are the only real complaints I had with Ashes Overworld. Now we can move on to the bosses. Okay, the Grave Tender and his Great Wolf. This boss is definitely more on my bad side concerning its implementation. For one thing, it's a PvP boss, or an attempt at one, and I do not need to go into that any more than I have. And I say an attempt because the Grave Tender himself seemed more like an afterthought rather than an important component of the encounter. Being so easily defeated, it looks like they just added him in there at the last second in order to have an excuse to have the champion's bone item drop. Concerning the Great Wolf, I immediately saw how From tried to make a second Sif fight with the big dog and the gravestone with the sword sticking out from the ground in front of it. However, From actually did not do that in my eyes. Rather, they made an excellent second Vort fight, which is a disappointment in and of itself. What upset me about the boss the most was how the environment was not used more. A plethora of giant pillars and icicles sticking from the ground could have been an amazing opportunity to have the wolf charge into the pillars to be stunned, and if he ran into an icicle, he could have taken damage. While the wolf could be somewhat easier as you guided him into the pillars and the ice spikes, the Grave Tender could have played a more integral role in the fight in order to make it more of a PvP boss if that is what From was going for. In the end, I just did not like this boss very much. However, I did like two things about the fight, one being that it was optional, and two, if you fight the Grave Wolf outside before the actual fight, it starts with diminished health, which I thought was a very immersive approach to the fight. Now let us move on to the meat and potatoes of the entire DLC. Sister Frieda. I loved so many things about this fight, I cannot even. For one thing, this fight is tough and a worthy send-off for Dark Souls 3 in my opinion. No, I did the Ring City first before Ashes. Regarding the fight itself, I adored how Frieda changed her fighting style and strategy each phase, going from a frontal assault to taking a step back in preference for ranged combat, only for her to become a complete monster in the third phase. In the second phase, there was such good synergy between Father Ariandel and Sister Frieda as well, as Father took the more aggressive role while Frieda defended him from behind, so you could not just sit on the slow-moving Ariandel the entire phase. I also like the connection to Priscilla with Frieda's invisibility mechanic. Truly, she is a painted world boss. Finally, let me delve into some literary devices by mentioning how From, in Frieda's second phase, juxtaposed ice and fire with Frieda and Ariandel's abilities respectively. While ice and fire would normally be opposing forces, this encounter has them working together in order to defeat the player, and I like that a lot. Okay, now I want to get what I did not like about Frieda out of the way. Before I go into my one issue, I would like to point out how, throughout Dark Souls 3, I found the game trained you to roll rather than resort to blocking most attacks, especially with bosses. Usually, the boss's attacks are too much to block, as you would normally run out of stamina before the combo is over, and you would normally take damage anyway. Therefore, it is better just to roll because it uses less stamina and is a better option 9 times out of 10. That is when I entered the fight with Frieda and discovered, at least for me, that I could not dodge any of her combos. It's only when I went to blocking attacks while interweaving rolls on occasion that I had any success with her. It may just be a personal problem and me being bad at the game, but after rolling the entire game like it taught me to do, suddenly saying, "Hey, I hope you don't mind finally using that shield of yours," felt kind of like a low blow in my eyes. But other than that, I did not really have any real gripes about Sister Frieda. She definitely was an awesome fight. Overall, both DLCs provided me with many hours of both elation and definitely frustration. And I would recommend getting them both to anyone of the few people, like myself, who had yet to get the DLCs. But other than that, tell me your thoughts on them. Did you like the Ring City and Ashes? And if you have any questions, quarrels, or queries, be sure to let me know. I'm Cucumber, and remember, pass the dressing.